thank you. You'd better know at the beginning that I'm basically an engineer. I did pass through psychology departments years ago. My affiliation in the program is given as University of Edinburgh. Yes, I did work in the psychology department there in 1972. Okay, right. Consciousness as it could be. So, I apologize, we have an ongoing conflict between Microsoft, Apple, and Hewlett-Packard here. So, right, okay. AI and consciousness. So with the latest peak in the AI hype cycle, discussion of the possibility that AI systems may or will become conscious, dominated by the assertions of technologists whose expertise in their own subject is not matched by their knowledge of the achievements of consciousness science. So let's face it, within consciousness science, artificial or machine consciousness is a minority sport, out of the mainstream, and this, I think, weakens the force of any responses to the would-be hegemonists of AI. Is there a way that artificial consciousness could move closer to the core discipline to strengthen it? Well, I think there is. It's due to its origins are in a long-haired, informally dressed pioneer who named what became almost a discipline, and this was in the context of a conference. So here he is. You may not recognize him, which is a pity, but it's Chris Langton, one of the founders of the discipline or subdiscipline called artificial life. And Chris wrote in 1989 a kind of pocket manifesto for what he wanted artificial life to be. Artificial life is the study of man-made systems that exhibit behaviors characteristic of natural living systems. It complements the traditional biological sciences concerned with the analysis of living organisms by attempting to synthesize lifelike behaviors within computers and other artificial media. And by extending the empirical foundation upon which biology is based beyond the carbon chain life that has evolved on Earth, artificial life can contribute to theoretical biology by locating life as we know it within the larger picture of life as it could be. Well, with hindsight, perhaps something like Langton's brief manifesto could serve to bring artificial consciousness closer to the mainstream of consciousness science, and it might look something like this. Artificial consciousness is the study of man-made systems that exhibit phenomena characteristic of natural conscious systems. It complements the traditional biological sciences concerned with the analysis of conscious organisms by attempting to synthesize consciousness-like phenomena within computers and other artificial media. And by extending the empirical foundation upon which consciousness is based beyond the carbon chain life that has evolved on Earth, artificial consciousness can contribute to consciousness science by locating consciousness as we know it within the larger picture of consciousness as it could be. Again, with apologies to Chris Langton. And I would like that to become the working creed of our enterprise. Okay, now artificial life has been going since the 1980s. Machine consciousness began really in the 1990s. Igor Alexander was one of the pioneers. We've got a journal which faded a few years ago, but it's back. We've had meetings, but no running conference every year, whereas artificial consciousness has fared rather better. What can we learn from artificial life? Well, I'm going to pick one thing. A key theme in artificial life right from the beginning has been emergence, the appearance of unexpected or interesting macro phenomena from a substrate of many simple micro entities. And in fact, the classic game before artificial life was named by Chris Langton was a lot concerned with with automata. On the left is Langton's ant in operation. This was a kind of abstraction and extension of Turing's idea. A thing moved around a grid, initially of white square, and there was a simple rule about what it did. It could move one step in the direction in which it was pointing. It would change the color of the square it was on, and it would then either turn point left or point right, and then it could change the color of the square it had landed on. It's very close to that. And with that, as you see on the right there, you can get amazingly complicated and unpredicted patterns, not necessarily unpredictable, and that shows a typical thing where after a lot of just woozing around and so on, it forms what's called a highway. Things like this came out of cellular automata more or less at the drop of a hat. And this is a form of emergence. Okay, in practice, there are two distinct aspects of emergence, and these aren't always distinguished. The first one is how and when does it happen? And the second is how can you explain it once it has happened? Well, how and when does it happen? It happens when you're doing something and when you don't expect what happens. You must be doing something within which emergence is both noticeable and possible. It's not just noticing something while doing something else. For example, this is how and when it does not happen. Richard Feynman put on record how one day in the cafeteria, some guy fooling around throws a plate in the air. By noticing the difference between the plate's angular velocity and that of the associated wobble, as you do, says Feynman, he was motivated to higher things. And he said, the diagrams and the whole business that I got the Nobel Prize for came from that piddling around with the wobbling plate. Okay, it was brilliant, it was genius in operation, but it wasn't emergence. So there are a lot of things that are on the borderline between there and emergence, and these are some quotes I particularly like. From Francis Crick, talking about discovering the structure of DNA in his work with James Watson, said, the major credit I think Jim and I deserve is for selecting the right problem and sticking to it. It's true that by blundering about, we stumbled on gold, but the fact remains we were looking for gold. Louis Pasteur, this is a quotation that is often misquoted as fortune favors the prepared mind. In fact, what he said was, in the field of observation, chance only favors the prepared mind. And finally, and this is, I won't say it's hit or miss or off target, Werner von Braun, my favorite quote of all, research is what I'm doing when I don't know what I'm doing. So all of these are loose, inspirational, but quite often emergent from the activity that they... Okay, so how can you explain it once it has happened? And this was referred to by Anil in his talk on Monday, and it turns out to be crucial in the classification of types of emergence. In a nutshell, it's classed as weak emergent, if you can explain it, and strong emergence, if you can't. And another formerly long-haired gentleman who set a discipline alight through naming something at a conference wrote a paper in 2006 that's very relevant to our science. Strong and Weak Emergence was the title of the paper, and David Sharmans wrote, are there strongly emergent phenomena? My own view is that the answer to this question is yes. I think there is exactly one clear case of a strongly emergent phenomenon, and that is the phenomenon of consciousness. It doesn't mean we won't be able to stumble across artificial consciousness while attempting something within which it might possibly become evident by accident. It means roughly that any explanation or description of the emergent phenomenon must involve facts that are not deducible from facts about the physical universe, about the substrate. See Dave Chalmers for details. So we can carry on looking. Now, what's it like to experience the discovery of a case of weak emergence and its explanation? Well, I build robots. Here are some robots. And I'll set it going in a minute. By chance, I was working at the University of Bielefeld on a project which was about pre-rational intelligence, and I hooked up with Ralph Beckers, a new PhD from Jean-Louis de Neuburg's lab. These were ant biologists, and they were trying to explain the collective behaviors of ants. And they had John Louis had done a simulation in which, and this is in the context of what are known as ant cemeteries. If you've got an ant's nest, usually outside the ant's nest, there's a pile of dead ants. That's the cemetery. And what they wanted to know, how did the dead ants get from the nest into the cemetery? Did the ants know where the cemetery was? What was the magic there? And Jean-Louis found that a very simple algorithm in a simple simulation would apparently achieve this. If an ant was wandering about the nest and came across a dead ant, if the local density of dead ants was low, it would pick it up. And then it would wander off, it might drop it occasionally, another ant would pick it up, and so on. But if one of these ants carrying a corpse came across an area where there was a high density of corpses, it would drop it. Over time, cumulatively, this would produce the cemetery. So Ralph and I decided to use robots to construct a cemetery using the simplest possible algorithm we could. But first, what we needed to do was to develop the basic robot. Ralph happened to have one that could be modified. It was very simple. It could go forwards. If it detected something on one side or the other, it could turn away from it. And I'll show you how we modified it. No, this should be playing. Yes. So there's the robot. You will see it's got a... just a minute. Right, okay, the torch doesn't work. It's got a cow catcher thing on the front, which operates a micro switch. We are using, instead of dead ants, we are using T-Lichten, T-lights, 81 of them, and the cow catcher at the front can actually push them along. We were concerned that if we achieved a cluster, then the robot might destroy it by going straight through it. So the cow catcher, if they're trying to push more than 3 of those, it will stop, reverse, and make a random turn. And what we were going to do in order to achieve the cluster was to build a mast on top with a vision system which would then compute the local density of T-lights, and that would determine whether the robot would push T-lights or reverse and leave them. So we never got that far. So I don't think we can see the timing on top here. Well, maybe it will appear. So anyway, they stooge around for a bit, and you see little clusters forming. Remember that they have no way of finding out what the local density is. They can only push 1 or 2, or stop and reverse if they're pushing 3 or more. Yes, so we are 8 minutes in, and things are happening. So it looks as if a large cluster might be forming. So an hour in, well, it's clear that there's a good one there. What will happen? And coming up to 2 hours, they've done it. In other words, our year-long project had been done in 2 weeks, or so we thought. So let's get past that. We'd done what we set out to do in the first couple of weeks. How could we fill the rest of the time? Well, how could we explain the result? What was going on? Why hadn't we anticipated it? How repeatable was it? Could it be extended to other situations? Would we have enough time to do all this? This is a real challenge. As Anil said in his slide, you have to work hard at the explanation for even weak emergence. Other people didn't help, right? Oh, we went to the University of Bochum to an Institute of Neural Networks, and they had a look. They said, well, it's just a hardware simulation of a differential equation, and therefore it's trivial. And that was the end of their interest in it. An American source said, the robots are too crude for anyone to believe this would happen in a properly conducted experiment. But the most frequent statement was, well, I've simulated this, and it doesn't work, and so on. And I'll have something to say about that in a minute. But once we analysed it, it turned out to be an unusual instance of stigmergy, which is a concept that developed by ant biologists and termite biologists to explain the complex behaviours of social insects. A local environmental change produced by the behaviour of one agent affects the later choice of the behaviour of other agents in that location, such that over time, the cumulative effects yield a macro-level effect. What social insects normally use is pheromones. They might have 80 or 90 different pheromones, each of which can trigger a different behavior. So, but in our work, there was none of the pheromones. It's adding a puck to a cluster makes it a bit wider and the curvature is less. It increases the probability that a robot that is moving pucks will collide with the cluster because it's bigger and add its pucks to the cluster, and it reduces the chance that a robot skimming the edge of the cluster will remove one or two packs. And it would take the 3 robots there about 2 hours to do that. A single robot could do it in 12 hours. If you're easily bored, this is not an area to get into. One interesting thing was that we had a Kantian philosopher attached to our group, and he would come down and watch the robots for hours, scratching his chin, because he just couldn't get it to fit into his philosophical framework. Okay, it turned out we'd been very, very lucky indeed. Small changes in the environment or the robot could cause it to fail. We'd always done this stuff on either a lino floor, a wooden floor, or a thin carpet. We had very embarrassed when we did a demonstration in the boardroom of the Institute of Electrical Engineers in London. A very thick boardroom carpet. Not just thick, but it had a nap. The fibres didn't stick up that way. They were all pointing the same way, which meant that the friction in that direction was much lower than the friction in the other direction. So we set them going, and pretty soon afterwards, all the pucks were arranged against the far wall. Ah, right, we hadn't thought of that. And we found, you would have noticed that our boundary was just made of wallpaper slung between some chair legs, moved a bit, and it was white. We found that the reflectance and the hardness of the boundary could determine whether a puck left at the boundary could be picked up or not. If you got this wrong, then they'd all be on the boundary, scattered all about. The sun was a problem because it provides infrared light. The sensors for sensing the boundary and other robots are infrared, and so you'd get random behavior on the robots. It would stop working. Right. And even the range and sensitivity of the infrared sensors we used on the robots was a problem. If they were too powerful and the sensitivity was too high, every time a robot turned, it would trigger the turn in the other robots, and so on. So it's very, very delicate. So, is there any way to run a scientific investigation? Well, perhaps not. But it happened to me again in 1997 when I was working with a Dutch student at Hewlett-Packard Labs on controlling telecommunications networks. He was inspired by a certain behavior of ants. We put it together, and somehow we found we had almost optimal control. It beat the pants off anything else, and it took us a while to understand why. And the same happened in 2000, again, working with robots on ant behaviors. We managed to get robots sorting. Ants sort their brood. They got eggs, the small ones and the larger, in concentric rings. And we managed to get that again by accident, by a misunderstood instruction from me to the PhD student. Instead of doing exactly as I said, he thought, well, I'll only go halfway, and so on. And then as I was watching it, I was able to clap him on the back and say, Chris, your PhD is assured. And that was a bit easier to explain. And those 3 papers are my 3 most cited, right? 2,777 citations altogether. So weak emergence as a method has worked for me. And as far as I can see, the trick is to mess around in the right area to give chance the opportunity to operate in your favor and keep your eyes open. And remember the possibility of producing strong emergence. Okay, there's a lot of trouble with consciousness, and I think the trouble started with Thomas Nagel in What Is It Like to Be a Bat? I'm quite happy with the what is it like bit. This is a substitute for the word experience, but to be a bat, I think, implying that it's something to do with being one thing and so on, and it's a problem. And he actually wrote, and this is all over the internet, I can't believe it's right, I assume we all believe that bats have experience. After all, they are mammals, and there is no more doubt that they have experience than that mice or pigeons or whales have experience. I wouldn't have classed pigeons amongst mammals, even though they do produce a sort of milk, but I found it's a very frequently asked question on the internet, are pigeons mammals? So we can excuse that. And then there's even without the benefit of philosophical reflection, anyone who's spent some time in an enclosed space with an excited bat knows what it's like to encounter a fundamentally alien form of life. I can't digest that at all. Maybe philosophers could help me. And this is I have said that the essence of the belief that bats have experience is that there is something that it is like to be a bat. I don't know how many of you have come across the Hensel twins. They're in their early 30s now. This is just a sample from a brief video of theirs, which should...
We wanted to do this documentary so people wouldn't have to always stare and take pictures, because we don't like when they take pictures, so they just knew who we are and stuff.
As they've grown, much of their life is still the same. They still live in the same small town in Minnesota with their 14-year-old brother Cody, 12-year-old sister Morgan, parents Mike and Patty, and the family dog Sadie. To put it simply, Abby and Brittany are not morning people.
They need to have more sleep.
When they wake up in the morning, they're usually cranky.
When they get up in the morning, they're very crabby.
From the moment they start their day, Abby and Brittany are an incredible display of teamwork. From doing their hair to putting on makeup, they appear to be totally in sync, but that doesn't mean they always agree.
It's fine, don't touch it. Believe me, we are totally different people. We usually bargain with each other, like, if you do this, I'll give you that, or we take turns. We take turns a lot.
When they first started to drive, it was kind of scary because they would hit the brakes and go too slow and then go too fast and then too slow.
Hold on, slow it down, man. Don't worry. Why do you have your blinker on? Oh.
The pressure is on because tomorrow, Abby and Brittany turn 16, and first thing in the morning, they head to the DMV for the driving portion of their licensing test. But the bad news is, 2 tests means 2 chances to fail.
We wanted to do this document.
So, what's it like? Is there anything it is like to be the single organism that is Abigail and Brittany? They're not totally separate, because there are occasions on which you have to think this is not one or the other, it is the two of them together. They touch type without speaking. How do they manage that? Anyway, moving on, where do we go from there? Well, that's a single physical evolved systems in a physical world with proximal, distal, and internal sensory and motor elements. What if experiences can occur within systems involving computers? Well, the closest analog would be a single physical mobile robot containing a computer with internal, proximal, and distal sensors and motors. The design could have been achieved by standard procedures, or perhaps by processes of artificial evolution constrained by contingencies modeled on those of natural evolution. For example, maximizing lifespan in a hostile environment. If we build such a system, where should we look for experiences? In the processes inside the robot, of course, not in the outward behavior, and I was delighted to hear Lenore and Manuel emphasizing that. It's what goes on inside the mechanism, not what comes out. You can't infer consciousness from what comes out, at least I believe that. And I did produce a diagram years ago to say where I want to look. The big green circle is the world, and the larger red square is the robot. And inside the robot, there is a model of the robot and a model of the world. And there is interaction between two, and I think that is where to look for it. So what we did, being engineers and thinking in straight lines, right, okay, we're going to build a robot with a human-like body. Nobody had attempted this before, and we can see why. So, if we can, right. So this is what we built. It's got a skeleton abstracted from Gray's Anatomy, but the key thing about it is that it's got muscles and tendons which are elastic, just like ours, right? So it wobbles an awful lot. The neuroscientists who saw it said, oh, well, it hasn't got a cerebellum. A cerebellum is what it needs in order to be able to control its movements. And it certainly couldn't. So that was mistake number one, to actually say we need a robot that is like a human body. It turns out still to be uncontrollable. We needed the bit inside, so we built a model, a somewhat abstracted model of the robot. We were lucky that at the time we did this, the first generally available physics-based software came out, which would reflect all physical characteristics, including contacts. And what you see there is we're trying to get the simulated robot to throw this heavy thing. And you will see when we finally find out which sequence of movements will actually throw it, right? You see the wobbling. Yeah. Right. But this was good. So, and we could actually construct, that's a minute. Right. We could actually construct a model of the world if we wanted and put that in. And what we did, we called this imagination. We called it functional imagination in the robot. And this was done with a PhD student, my robot builder, Rob Knight. So there we see the real situation downstairs. In the bottom, down there, in the bottom left-hand corner is the robot's eye view from the actual camera in the eye of the robot. And up there is what we see happening. The robot is trying to find a movement that will produce a horizontal red shape, right? And once it finds it, it downloads it to the temporarily frozen robot, which will actually produce the action. Okay, it looks Mickey Mouse. It was an awful lot of work to do, but I think in principle, this is the kind of area, but with much better robot, much better simulation, and possibly someone other than engineers involved in the enterprise. This is where to look. Okay, right at the intersection there. Okay, so if the focus of attention is on the software internal models, digital techniques, software, do we really need to have a real robot in the real world to supply the data if the interesting stuff is likely to be happening in a software environment anyway? It's much easier to use software models of the real world and the real robot to generate the data for the robot's internal models. So we did this by giving the simulated robot its own simulated world and simulated body. So what would be the difference between the interactions between these and those of the internal models of the real robot? Well, this is a very nice way to think, because why robots suck? I've had 35 years of working with robots, and I can tell you all about them, and my advice is stay away from them, right? From the point of view of efficiency, tractability, access to information, sheer practicality, this is something I wrote a few years ago, the virtual option beats the real option hands down. Working with real robots in the real world is slow and difficult. Robots break, age, wear out, need updating, are expensive, and need constant engineering attention. Also, the real world is incompletely knowable and changes with time. But it's impossible to speed up real time to which robots in the real world are unavoidably confined, or to repeat an experiment exactly. That's one of the things about digital technologies. You can know everything and you can repeat everything exactly. You can put a bit of noise in there if you want and so on, but in principle you have perfect knowledge and perfect access. So with a virtual approach, changes are easy. Knowledge is in principle complete, multiple parallel implementations can be run, real time is not a constraint, and the base technology improves at an exponential rate. So if you think that it might be possible to produce real consciousness in software, then this is the way to go. So, a later project, which not many people were interested in the actual robot investigation of something that might have characteristics of consciousness, but the robot was a big hit, and the European Commission gave us 3 million euros to develop the robot. So, and what we did then was that we built 6 real physical robots, but in order to learn things, rather than try and get the robot to work out how to hit a target that was within reach round about it, we simulated it, and this shows it's not quite emergence, but unexpected things happen. You will see a blue bottle appear just behind the robot's head, and the robot is using reinforcement learning to try and find the movement that efficiently does that. What we were trying to find out, rather than control individual muscles, and there were so many of them, to use synergies. What we do, humans do, is the synergies activate a group of muscles so that you just need to pass a couple of parameters to them, basically, and they will take care of the details. We were trying to find out what were the natural synergies of our robot. So it discovered a way of hitting the bottle which was effective, but we didn't really want to adopt that synergy. So this is the unexpected. We should have foreseen this, we didn't, and there's lots more like this. If you do stuff, real stuff, you're often surprised. Engineers call this errors. Software people just call it bugs, but there's the well-known software technique of selling a bug as a feature. We don't really have the option with real engineering. So, anyway, let's get rid of this. AI and consciousness, at last. Well, both AI and what I have proposed operate by building and exploiting software models of data from certain domains. And they could even use the same computer at the same time. And given the nature of emergence, it might be possible for either of them to produce configurations constituting some form of consciousness. I can easily see how this might occur and be recognizable in the case of our simulated robot, but I can't see how any of the current AI schemes could produce anything that could be recognized as characteristic of consciousness, least of all a large language model output consisting of a series of ungrounded symbols selected from their contexts of further ungrounded symbols. It's not even intelligence, but in a few minutes you'll get a talk from Dave Chalmers, which will take the whole thing to bits, I hope. In the old days, when I started, it was more or less compulsory to feature a Gary Larson animal cartoon in your talk, and there's one that gnaws at me whenever I read anything about the alleged AIs. Well, there it goes again, and here we sit without opposable thumbs. In other words, there is no connection to the real world in any of these. There could be. No, they don't seem exercised to try it. They just say, oh, yes, it can answer any question, it's intelligent, and soon it will be conscious. Anyway, to conclude, thank you for your consciousness.